So, welcome to LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. Thanks for joining me. I've got more than 24 clips on several different topics for what I think should be a worthwhile show tonight. As always, this is my weekly broadcast of the best clips from the Sunday morning news analysis shows from the corporate media here in the United States, along with a little political comedy and along with my commentary between the clips. Although NBC didn't broadcast Meet the Press this week because of auto racing, I'll be using clips from the Sunday morning news shows on the other four of the regular Big Five outlets other than NBC, meaning ABC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News. Plus, I'll use some quasi-news clips from Friday's Real Time with Bill Maher on HBO. The topics I'll be covering tonight include today's election in Ukraine, the horrible shooting rampage in Santa Barbara over the weekend, President Obama's surprise visit to Afghanistan today, and a few other topics I've listed down in the video description, which also shows I want to start off with continuing developments in the scandal about the way we give medical care to our veterans, which Bill Maher recapped pretty well in his monologue on Friday, ending with the satirical edge you can see over in this clip.
That's a scandal. Now, that is a real scandal that's going on. If you're not following this, VA hospitals are supposed to provide care within 30 days. A lot of them have not. We are finding out more and more as this goes on because, at least at the Phoenix hospital, they were creating fake paperwork to make it look like they were treating these people when they weren't. Now, of course, Republicans have pounced. They're outraged. They say, how dare you lie about caring for the people who got hurt in the war we lied them into?
So yeah, that comment from Bill Maher kind of reminds me of that video I made a week or so ago about Fox News broadcast where they edited Senator John Tester's statement about the VA scandal so that there was no mention of the cost of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the pressure that they're putting on the Veterans Administration. Of course, that's just one of the factors in this scandal. And I want to show a clip from Fox News Sunday where you can see that they actually kind of flipped this around a little. They didn't leave out the whole Iraq and Afghanistan veterans issue. They actually had a representative from an organization that represents veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan. His name is Derek Bennett, and they had him there to confirm the Fox News view that this is a scandal that is President Obama's fault. And you can see how Chris Wallace set that up when he was asking Derek Bennett his question, sort of contrasting different things that President Obama has said over the years about the Veterans Administration back from when he was a candidate. And I'll talk a little bit more about that after I show that clip here.
The president says, not unreasonably, that he wants to see studies coming from Secretary Shinseki in the next week and from the Inspector General. That might not be till July or August, but looking at it ourselves, there have been reports of gaming of the system going all the way back to 2008. And in fact, President Obama, and we have some clips that we're going to play, President Obama has been talking about precisely this problem for years.
No veteran should have to fill out a 23-page claim to get care, or wait months, even years, to get an appointment at the VA. I have pledged to build a 21st century VA. We need to cut through the red tape, all with a simple mission. Cut those backlogs, slash those wait times, deliver your benefits sooner.
Mr. Bennett, given all of those comments, as I say, going back to 2007, does the president need still more studies before acting?
I don't think so, Chris. I mean, at this point, we agree strongly with candidate Obama, the first administration President Obama. There have been plenty of studies, scores of IG reports, GAO reports dating back to 2008, alleging gaming of the system, as you said. There was a transition team memo from President Bush to President Obama alleging that there's some gaming potentially going on. At some point, we have to stop studying and actually take action.
So how do you explain?
So yeah, there's the Fox News Sunday setup for the Veterans Administration scandal, or Department of Veterans Affairs scandal, where they pretty much showed it as a problem of President Obama. And I want to contrast that with something that was over on This Week with George Stephanopoulos, although Martha Raddatz was summing in. This is actually Martha Raddatz turning it over to their reporter Jim Avila, I'm not sure. He's talking about the VA scandal, and he makes several points that sort of take it out of the realm of being President Obama's fault and make it a more systemic problem, and a problem that Washington couldn't really see, as I'll talk a little bit more about after I show that clip here.
Now to the growing scandal at the Department of Veterans Affairs. Outrage over delays in life-saving care. This weekend, President Obama is demanding answers. ABC's Jim Avila has the latest.
The White House scrambling to contain a spreading scandal at the VA, sending a Mr. Fix-It, Deputy Chief of Staff Rob Neighbors, to the Phoenix VA, where it all began. The president calling his Veterans Affairs Secretary to the Oval Office and promising veterans anyone cooking the books to hide long delays to see a VA doctor will be punished.
I want every veteran to know we are going to fix whatever is wrong. I'm going to keep on fighting to deliver the care and the benefits and the opportunities that your families deserve.
It's a scandal that has traction across political parties and TV channels.
A real scandal, Jimmy Trump!
Whistleblowers coming forward to expose secret lists that hid long waits to see a doctor.
People actually died because of the delay.
Because of a delay in getting care.
Troy Burmish was a scheduler in Phoenix, ordered by hospital supervisors, he says, to hide the real wait times, months long, on handwritten, untraceable lists.
The bosses in Washington couldn't tell.
Yeah, no, there's no way.
They were looking at a computer screen which told them what?
Less than 2 weeks, which is not even close.
Veterans like Thomas Breen dying of painful cancer while waiting nearly a year to see a doctor.
He was delayed care completely and on that secret list because I have proof.
VA Secretary General Eric Shinseki ending the week visiting Capitol Hill to say he won't quit despite a wave of calls for him to resign, finally issuing this statement saying, "The scandal is of great personal concern to me, and if true, we will act." For This Week, Jim Avila.
So yeah, that was Jim Avila. I'm sorry, I mispronounced his name before, but he's the ABC reporter, and you notice his report there had several facts in it that the Fox News report didn't have that would make people think that isn't really President Obama's fault, or at least that there are parts of it that aren't his fault. The part where they had the whistleblower say that people in Washington wouldn't know because their computer will show that the waiting times are fine. That's the whole point of the secret waiting list, is to stop people in Washington from knowing what's going on. And I think the guy they actually fired, even though the media covered that as he was going to resign anyway, what's his name, Petzel, Dr. Petzel, who was underling of Shinseki, one of the people right below Shinseki. The media covered that as someone who was going to resign anyway, but I think he actually may have been the one most responsible for this fraud. Before I leave the ABC News coverage, I want to show, even though that report was more balanced in that it showed some reasons why it's a more systemic problem and not President Obama's fault specifically, I want to show ABC did actually still show that contrast between candidate Obama and President Obama, and that he was already promising reforms when he was running, and now many years later there's still problems in the VA. And so yeah, this is the clip from This Week with George Stephanopoulos right before they went to a panel discussion on it in this clip.
No veteran should have to fill out a 23-page claim to get care, or wait months, even years, to get an appointment at the VA. Any misconduct, whether it's allegations of VA staff covering up long wait times or cooking the books, I will not stand for it.
President Obama.
So yeah, you can see there that ABC, even though the report from Jim Avila, their reporter, had some more facts that were favorable to the Obama administration in it, they did show up the contrast between what President Obama said as a candidate and what he had to say in this last week. And before I leave the Veterans Administration scandal issue, I want to show one more clip from Face the Nation, CBS's Face the Nation, where they also covered the scandal. And Bob Schieffer was off this week. They had Major Garrett, who actually used to work for Fox News, and he was over on Face the Nation hosting for Bob Schieffer, interviewing Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger, asking him about the possibility of criminality. Well, actually, Kinzinger brought up criminality versus incompetence, and then Kinzinger said something that was kind of strange about the legal issue, and then he misstated the legal issue, as I'll talk about a little more after I show that clip here.
Say level of criminality, is that something you are certain of or suspicious about?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm kind of proud of that. But, you know, at the same time, if you have somebody that created a fake waiting list in order to make their numbers look better, more interested in protecting their bonuses and their job than in protecting those that have protected us, frankly, I think that is criminal negligence. And so, for me, I think it's gone from incompetence. When we were talking about a year or a 2-year backlog, that was incompetence, that was bureaucracy, that was something that we had to take a real strong approach on. But when it came to people have created fake waiting lists and veterans have died, I think that goes to the level of criminality. And that's where, you know, as the prior senator was saying, the Department of Justice needs to get involved in this. The president has got to show some intense outrage. And while I think General Shinseki needs to go, he's a great American, but I don't think he's fit for this. I haven't even seen the level of outrage out of him that I think we ought to be hearing, to know that there were fake waiting lists created to pad numbers.
So, I mean, most of that comment was reasonable, although I thought it was a little strange at the beginning there. He said that he was proud. He's not a lawyer, and he's proud of that. Like, I've never heard of someone being proud of not having graduated from law school. As someone who has graduated from law school, it doesn't seem like not being a lawyer really takes a lot of effort. And also, not being a lawyer gives you not the best perspective necessarily on whether something is a crime or not, because you may notice that Representative Adam Kinzinger in that clip I just showed said that the crime he was thinking about was criminal negligence because people died waiting on these waiting lists, when I think the federal crime we're probably really talking about is, I mean, the one that immediately came to mind, I remember from my corporate and white-collar crime class in law school that I took as an elective, is 18 U.S.C. 1001. I put a link to this statute down in the video description if you want to look at it yourself. But it basically makes it a crime to make a false statement to the federal government. You know, if it's part, you know, the Department of Veterans Affairs is part of the executive branch, so that's the jurisdiction here. And so anyone who falsifies, conceals, or covers up by any trick, scheme, or device a material fact, or makes any materially false, fictitious, or fraudulent statement or representation, and I think the secret waiting lists that are misstating waiting times are both qualify for both of those. In fact, the third one too, and that's fined under this title in prison not more than 5 years. That means it's a felony. So Representative Kinzinger, I can't say I'm proud not to be a lawyer, because I actually am a lawyer, and that's why I am able to give you that analysis of what the crime would be if it is proven that people kept these secret waiting lists and reported false waiting times to the federal government. That's the statute that I think Scooter Libby, the chief of staff of Vice President Cheney, was convicted under in the whole Valerie Plame scandal, where he wasn't actually convicted for outing the identity of a CIA agent, but he was convicted for lying to investigators when he was being investigated for that other crime, and that is actually a crime that is often charged when the underlying crime can't be proved, but if you lie to investigators when they're investigating, you get charged with 18 U.S.C. 1001. So we'll see if that ends up being the crime that people are charged with in this VA scandal. And anyway, those are the clips I want to show you about the VA scandal. And the next issue I want to cover, or breaking news this weekend, was this horrible shooting down in Santa Barbara. I watched several of the news conferences, the Sheriff Bill Brown's news conference, where he went through the whole 10 different crime scenes and the timeline of what happened, and it's just nasty. And I looked at, this guy had a YouTube channel where the day before the rampage he uploaded all these videos. I looked at some of those, and I skimmed through his 141-page manifesto, and I mean, the whole thing's pretty awful. And I'm not really going to cover what happened so much as cover the coverage of it. I want to make some criticisms of some of the ways that it was covered on some of the Sunday morning news shows this morning. First, I want to show you the report from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. This reporter's name is Clayton Sandell, and he's going to give a report. It's the only one of the networks this morning that actually showed clips of the suspected shooter, the pretty much certain shooter in the case, the guy named the 22-year-old Elliot Rodger. They all showed stills of him, but ABC News was the only one that actually showed clips from the videos with the audio, and then they ended with a clip of the father of one of the victims. These are two issues I'm going to use to critique the coverage of this terrible incident, which I'll talk about a little more after I show the clip from ABC's This Week. This is their reporting, Clayton Sandell, reporting from Santa Barbara this morning here.
Normally I would say good morning, but right now it is not a good morning here. Isla Vista is a community in deep sorrow. Behind me, the apartment complex where Elliot Rodger lived and where police say he murdered his first 3 victims. As shocked residents of this Santa Barbara community grieve, a clearer picture is starting to form of 22-year-old Elliot Rodger's twisted plan, a plan he'd apparently been working on for months.
Tomorrow is the day of retribution. The day in which I will have my revenge against humanity.
In this YouTube video posted the day before his rampage, Rodger reveals one motive, his rejection by women.
Girls gave their affection and sex and love to other men, but never to me.
He lays out his plan to exact revenge in a rambling 141-page manifesto. He writes, I found out that the sorority with the most beautiful girls is Alpha Phi sorority. I know exactly where their house is, and I've sat outside it in my car to stalk them many times. According to authorities, Rodger drove to that sorority house and started banging on the door.
Fortunately, no one opened the door. And shortly afterwards, witnesses reported seeing 3 young women who were standing outside in the vicinity, shot by the suspect.
One of 10 terrifying crime scenes on this video, people diving for cover when the shooting began.
He fired 2 shots in. It stopped for about 2 seconds before they just started raining through.
Rodger's family says that in the weeks before the shooting, they reached out to authorities. They also say he'd been receiving mental health treatment.
It's very, very apparent that he was severely mentally disturbed when you review that document.
Still so many unanswered questions and a heartfelt plea from one victim's father.
Too many have died. We should say to ourselves, not one more.
Now, of the 13 people who were injured in this attack this morning, 6 of them remain in the hospital. Martha?
Now, you notice in that story there, they showed a very short clip of the father of one of the victims. Richard Ramirez is the father's name. And I'm going to criticize Fox News in a few minutes for leaving out a really important part of what that father said. And ABC actually left it out as well, which I thought was kind of surprising. And also, as I mentioned, ABC was the only station that played actual video and audio of the supposed shooter, the fairly certain shooter at this point from what I've seen of the reports. Anyway, they're the only ones who showed his videos or clips of his videos, which is an issue because even though most of the stations, or CNN didn't show it, and CBS didn't show it, and Fox News didn't show it, Fox News was actually kind of self-righteous about that, and I want to show you what I mean by that in this clip here.
California seaside community. Police say 22-year-old Elliot Rodger stabbed 3 men to death before a shooting spree on the streets near the University of California, Santa Barbara. Rodger laid out his deadly plan in a video just hours before the attack, but we are not going to play his message and give the killer the spotlight he so clearly wanted. We're going to have...
So yeah, that was Fox News saying they're not going to give the killer the spotlight he wanted, but they showed his picture, and they did do a long report describing what he said, which is also what CBS and CNN did. They described what he said without actually showing clips of him saying it in his own words, which I thought was, I'm not sure exactly why that's different, but I do in some ways agree with the sentiment of not glorifying the guy, but since this just happened and you want to try to understand his mindset, to understand why this happened, if it is even understandable, I don't fault the media or news programs for at least looking into it to that extent. And I'm going to show Fox News did summarize what he said like the other networks, and they also showed a very short clip of the father of the victim, Richard Ramirez. This is a victim who was shot in a convenience store, because one of the 10 different crime scenes in Santa Barbara was this guy drove by this convenience store and just shot randomly in the doorway, and he killed one person that way. And anyway, that's covered in, this is a story from Fox News reporter Dominic Di Natale, I believe is his name. And you'll see that they describe in detail what the suspect's motivations, even though they don't play actual clips of him saying it in his own words. And they also have this very short clip of the father that I'll talk about a little more here.
Hey there, Chris. Yes, this is a memorial weekend marred by the work of a madman, and that's how people here in this student enclave of Isla Vista will remember the act of murder and savagery. Several thousand people turned out for a silent vigil procession walking through the student enclave here last night. That solemnity in stark contrast, frankly, with the anger from the father of one of the victims. That was Christian Ross Martinez, the 20-year-old student gunned down at the Isla Vista deli.
When will this insanity stop? When will enough people say, stop this madness? We don't have to live like this. Too many have died. We should say to ourselves, not one more.
Surveillance footage of that killing reveals customers diving for cover as the gunman opens fire inside the store. The investigation is proceeding on several fronts today, Chris. The 10 separate locations of this atrocity. Also, the sheriff here saying Rodger's main target was the Alpha Phi sorority house. He shot 3 women outside there. Before that, he'd stabbed to death 3 people at his apartment complex, possibly his roommates. Then there's those YouTube videos in which he pledges his day of retribution, is how he described it, because, quote, no beautiful girl wants to be my girlfriend. He continued, I will take great pleasure in slaughtering all of you. There's also the blood-chilling manifesto filled with vicious hatred towards women and his plans to kill as many as possible. Here's what we know about Elliot Rodger. He was 22, the son of an assistant director of the Hunger Games. He was in therapy, was a high-functioning patient with Asperger's syndrome and had difficulty making friends. There were 3 run-ins with police he had. Just 4 weeks ago, the authorities checked in on the welfare of Rodger. A visit at his family's request. Police found him polite and courteous. In his manifesto, Rodger said had officers stepped inside his apartment at that time, they would have discovered his deadly arsenal, and that was 3 semi-automatic handguns and at least 500 unspent rounds of ammunition. All of it obtained legally, Chris. Back.
So you notice Fox News there emphasizes how the guns were obtained legally, so that it's not an illegal gun thing. And I thought they also went out of their way to cut out part of the statement of the father of one of the victims, Richard Ramirez. And as I pointed out earlier, ABC did the same thing. They cut out what I thought was a really important part. Over on CBS, Face the Nation, however, they played the entire statement from that father, and see if you can figure out what the this is actually, I mean, you get kind of teary-eyed watching, or at least when I saw this is, maybe it's because I'm a parent, this made me kind of emotional, but I'll talk about the political part of it a little more after I show that clip here.
Richard Martinez, the father of one of the students killed, had this to say to reporters yesterday.
You don't think it'll happen to your child until it does. Chris was a really great kid. Ask anyone who knew him. His death has left our family lost and broken. Why did Chris die? Chris died because of craven, irresponsible politicians and the NRA. They talk about gun rights. What about Chris's right to live? When will this insanity stop? When will enough people say, stop this madness? We don't have to live like this. Too many have died. We should say to ourselves, not one more. Thank you. That's it.
We want to.
So yeah, that's Richard Martinez. I think I mistakenly said his last name was Ramirez, which that's kind of a unfortunate mistake, because I think Richard Ramirez is actually the name of a serial killer I remember from like 20 years ago. But Richard Martinez, the father of a victim of a mass shooting killer, I think that was kind of a heartrending statement from Richard Martinez, and I think that where he put the blame on craven politicians and the NRA, that is newsworthy, and I don't understand why that didn't make it in the ABC report, and I think I do understand why it didn't make it into the Fox News report, although I suppose if I'm going to criticize one, I have to criticize them both. But anyway, I thought that was definitely worth reporting on, and it actually also made it over into CNN State of the Union. Candy Crowley referred to that statement from Richard Martinez when interviewing the congressperson who represents that district, Lois Capps, and I'll talk about that a little more after I show that clip here.
This is some of what he had to say. I want to play it for our viewers.
Excellent.
Why did Chris die? Chris died because of craven, irresponsible politicians and the NRA. They talk about gun rights. What about Chris's right to live?
Just this mixture, Congresswoman, of fury and grief. It's very, very hard to watch and impossible to bear. We should first point out that 3 of the victims, I believe, were stabbed to death and others were shot. But setting that aside, does he have a point? Is there something that you see that is doable in the mental health area, in the gun area, in the, one of the things the police chief, I will say, said is that he thinks the mental health community needs to step up more.
This is a moment for us to give voice to the tragedy that was just so powerful in Christopher's father's message to us all. I take that to heart. I'm just overwhelmed with the loss and totally dedicated to wanting to give a voice to what the father is asking all of us to do on behalf of the son he no longer has.
It is hard.
So yeah, you can see that CNN did play the important part of the clip about the politicians and the NRA, whether you agree with what that father, Richard Martinez, said or not. I think you have to agree that that is a newsworthy part of his statement that's worth showing on a news program that's covering this event. And I wasn't actually all that impressed with Lois Capps' answers. They seem mainly platitudes, not really talking about specific actions. And I want to show one more answer she gave in her interview with Candy Crowley. She is a Democrat, so I guess I'm criticizing a Democrat by, I don't know, maybe today wasn't the day for more specifics, but I just didn't think her answers were that strong. And I want to show, this is Candy Crowley asking her about to respond to the sheriff, the Santa Barbara County sheriff, Bill Brown, said basically that he didn't think that there was much that could be done in terms of law enforcement responses that could stop this kind of thing from happening. And I'll show that clip and talk about it a little more after I show it here.
We had him on this show. I want to play you something that he said at the first news conference about incidents like this.
The problem with an incident like this is it's obviously the work of a madman, and it's just unfortunate that these kinds of circumstances occur, but there are very, very limited ways in which they can be prevented.
It is certainly not an acceptance on his part of this kind of violence, but there is a feeling that there is just, in this country, with these laws, there certainly are things that you can be as vigilant as you want. This case, this young man apparently had seen lots of psychiatrists and mental health workers. He got a gun perfectly legally in California, which has pretty strict gun laws, and it does make you wonder, are there just things that are not preventable?
Well, I do commend our sheriff. The team did a very courageous response to this incident in Isla Vista. Who knows, it could have been much worse. But what I want to do now, Candy, and you say it so clearly, how can we give voice to these yearning students and community members who say this loss is something we don't want to see continued? How can we come together as a community? How can we support one another so that a young person like this man does not fall through the cracks? And that's what I'm dedicated to doing. And I know I speak on behalf of so many folks here in this community, peaceful today, but a scene of real terror and tragedy such a short time ago.
So yeah, that's kind of what I mean about platitudes and falling through the cracks. I'm not sure exactly how he fell through the cracks, and that I'm not sure exactly what they could have done to have found him earlier. Unless they searched his room. There was this contact between him and police officers, I think it was April 30th, so like 3 weeks ago. And he wrote about it in his manifesto and said that if they had searched his room, they would have found his guns and ammunition that he ended up using. But they never did that, and it didn't sound to me like they had the cause to do that or the cause to bring him in, because he didn't seem like he was really a danger to himself or others, and that's the standard that they have to use. And I want to show a clip of the sheriff, Bill Brown, was actually interviewed this morning on Face the Nation by Major Garrett, and Major Garrett asked him about that contact on April 30th with law enforcement, and he basically explained it that way, as you can see over in this clip.
Well, Major, on that day we were asked by the mental health department to conduct a welfare check with Elliot Rodger to determine if he was a danger to himself or anyone else. This was prompted by a call by a third party. The mental health department contacted one of his relatives who had expressed some concern about his well-being. Our deputies went to check on Mr. Elliott, contacted him outside his residence. They found him to be, at that time, rather quiet and timid. He was polite and courteous. He was able to convince the deputies that this was all a misunderstanding, that although he was having some social problems, he was probably not going to be staying in school and going to be returning home, and he was able to make a very convincing story that there was no problem, that he wasn't going to hurt himself or anyone else, and he just didn't meet the criteria for any further intervention at that point. And obviously, looking back on this, it's a very tragic situation, and we certainly wish that we could turn the clock back and maybe change some things. But at the time that the deputies interacted with him, he was able to convince them that he was okay, And when you read his autobiography and manifesto that he wrote, it's very apparent that he was able to convince many people for many years that he didn't have this deep, underlying, obvious mental illness that ultimately manifested itself in this terrible tragedy.
Now, I do agree with what the sheriff is saying there about not having the grounds to bring him in on that April 30th contact. He's talking about, I think it's California Welfare and Institution Codes 5150, which is let you put someone on a temporary hold. I think it's like 48 hours if you have reason to believe that they're a danger to themselves or others, and if they talk to the guy and he seemed reasonable. And the part I'm not sure about is he talked about him being deeply disturbed, and I mean, he had this diagnosis of high-functioning Asperger's syndrome, from what I understand, and one of the strange things about that diagnosis is, from what I understand, Asperger's syndrome, which I know, people have that, and that it's a real thing, but in terms of a diagnosis, I think it's going to no longer be included in the next version of the DSM. Was a Diagnostic and Statistics Manual. I think the DSM-5 is the next version that they're coming out with, and Asperger's syndrome is no longer going to be explicitly included, although those people will still be part of, I think it's called autism spectrum disorder, so they'll still be on the autism spectrum. The name Asperger's syndrome won't be there anymore in the new DSM. And in terms of deep mental illness, I mean, from what I saw, I mean, it's hard to, I don't know. I don't feel really qualified, and I don't know if Sheriff Brown is really qualified to call him deeply disturbed, or I don't know if he was just like really bitter, or a bitter loner who, I mean, it's hard to tell. And that's actually one of the problems with something like California Welfare and Institution Codes 5150 is that you're sending police officers out to make a psychological determination, and I'm not really qualified and they're not really qualified, but I guess they need more training. Maybe that's something that could happen, is that I actually saw a discussion on one of the other channels. I didn't take the clip, where they were talking about how the mentally ill people that police officers usually run into are more of like the homeless variety. They run into a lot of mentally ill street people, and so when they see like well-dressed, clean-cut, polite, shy, withdrawn, maybe college student type guy, it's hard for them to recognize that as mental illness. So that may also be a factor. And I want to show one other answer of Sheriff Bill Brown from his interview with Major Garrett on CBS's Face the Nation, where he talked about how all the guns were obtained legally, because the guy didn't have, even though he had this history of treatment and even contact with police, he never had the kind of hold that you need to fail a background check to buy firearms. And I'll talk about that a little more after I show that clip here.
I don't have that information right now. There's been a lot of discussion about whether or not he was able, or how he was able to obtain weapons. He purchased 3 of these handguns over the preceding year before the incident. And during the course of his interaction with medical health professionals, he apparently had never been either institutionalized or committed for an involuntary hold of any kind. And those are the 2 triggers that actually would have made him a prohibited person in terms of a firearms purchase. So he was able, sadly, to obtain those 3 firearms.
Sheriff.
So yeah, that's how he got the guns that he used, and Major Garrett actually used that fact when he talked to Connecticut Senator Richard Blumenthal later in the broadcast to ask him, there are all these gun laws that didn't pass after the Sandy Hook shooting, but would any of them really have made any difference? And I'll show how Democratic Senator from Connecticut Richard Blumenthal answered that question, and talk about it a little more after I show that clip here.
Before I go to Senator Thune, let me follow up Senator Blumenthal. The sheriff told us that there were no flags that would have prompted a check on the legally purchased weapons that Elliot Rodger had, and he didn't seem to have large or larger than normal size magazines for his weapons. Do you believe the legislation the Senate did not pass would have made any difference in this case?
The legislation that failed to pass, it got support from 55 senators, would have provided a mental health initiative with more resources, greater ability for the Santa Barbara police to intervene, to use the sheriff's word, to have professionals trained in diagnosing and detecting this kind of derangement. Obviously, not every kind of gun violence is going to be prevented by laws out of Washington, but at least we can make a start. And I am going to urge that we bring back those bills, maybe reconfigure them to center on mental health, which is a point where we can agree that we need more resources to make the country healthier and to make sure that these kinds of horrific, insane, mad occurrences are stopped. And the Congress will be complicit if we fail to act.
So yeah, that was the Democratic senator from Connecticut, Richard Blumenthal, saying that he thinks that there is some legislative solution that would affect this problem in terms of giving more mental health resources, though I'm not exactly sure how that would have affected this particular shooting, because this guy was already seeing multiple therapists and had, from what I understand, his father is kind of a rich Hollywood director, or I don't know, but yeah, he was driving around in this big black BMW, which is kind of a expensive car, and he didn't seem to lack for resources or therapists, or what he seemed to lack for was like human empathy or connection, human connections, or I mean, it's hard to say. Like I said, I watched some of his videos and I skimmed through his manifesto, and it was just really disturbing. And I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, so I'm not going to try to diagnose him, but there was definitely a lot of bitterness and a lot of disconnection from humanity that was just really sad. And before I leave, I want to show, I don't know, this clip that CNN State of the Union, they interviewed one of the victims from his hospital bed, a guy, I guess he was skateboarding and got hit by this guy's car, by the shooter. Actually, he's not just a shooter, he killed 3 people with by stabbing them, and he also got several people injured by hitting them with his car. And CNN actually they interviewed one of the victims of the automobile assault that I thought was a little bit odd, that I'll talk about a little more after I show it. The name of the victim is Nick Pasichuke, I believe is his name, and I'll talk about that a little more after I show that final clip on the Santa Barbara shooting here.
Basically just had gotten food at Freebirds and was longboarding down the street while my friend in front of me was on his bike. And needless to say, he and I were just talking, and out of nowhere get swooped up by a car and thrown about 50 yards or 50 so far down the street. It was all a real blur, and then next thing I know, I'm on the ground, can't move my legs, and yeah.
So yeah, I thought that was the most newsworthy part of that interview, where he said what he saw, which wasn't much, that he was skateboarding and then found himself on the pavement after getting hit by a car, not knowing what happened. And then Candy Crowley asked him like multiple additional questions about, like, when did you find out that there was all this shooting going on? And he said after, the police and the ambulances showed up. And I don't know, there was something about that interview that seemed a little strange, a little gratuitous to me. But anyway, I just wanted to make that final point. Like I said, I mean, the event itself, like so many of these shootings, the Sandy Hook shooting, going back to Columbine, and I mean, even worse, what was that Bell Tower shooting at that university in Texas in the 60s? I can't remember, but these shootings, I don't know what to say about them that I haven't said and when I've covered some previous shootings, but I can critique the coverage, which I hope nobody finds inappropriate, but I did want to critique it to the extent that I have. And so I've showed those clips, and I want to cover a few more topics before I end. I want to cover, there's an election going on in Ukraine to elect the new president to replace the one who was ousted by these I guess the Western people say he was ousted by popular democratic protests, and then the pro-Russian people say he was ousted in a coup. Or anyway, so there are elections going on in Ukraine to create a definitely legitimate government. I mean, as long as the elections are legitimate. And this actually would have been maybe the top story if it hadn't been for some of these other stories that I've already covered, the shooting and the VA scandal. And Ukraine actually didn't get a lot of coverage on some of the broadcasts. First, I want to show how it was covered over on CNN State of the Union, where it got some significant coverage. This is a fairly long report from their reporter Jim Sciutto, talking about how the election is going okay on the western side of Ukraine, but on the eastern side of Ukraine by Russia, not so much, which I'll talk a little bit more about after I show that clip here.
Well, up until a couple of hours ago, about halfway through the election day, the turnout nationally about 40%. That's still leaving several hours to vote. And at least here in Kiev and the western part of the country, we saw great participation, long lines, certainly in polling stations here in the capital. That, of course, contrasting with the situation in the eastern regions bordering Russia. We just returned from there this morning, Donetsk, Lugansk, where the violence has been concentrated and where only a fifth of the polling stations were open because, and we spoke to a number of witnesses out there who saw this, armed militants, pro-Russian separatists, forcibly shutting those polling stations down and intimidating voters from going, making them fear for their lives. So that's a problem. You have an imbalance now with good turnout in the west, the central part of the country, lower turnout in the east because of that interruption. That's what's happening today. But as you mentioned, who would have guessed, Candy, that this year crisis in Europe would be at the top of the president's foreign policy agenda, but that's just what's happened here, overshadowing to some degree, as you say, the challenges in Syria, in Asia, and also in Afghanistan, winding down the war in Afghanistan. This is a continuing crisis. A big question today, can Ukraine emerge from these crucial national presidential elections with a figure who can unite this country that is divided in many ways, divided between East and West, divided between affinity for the European Union and affinity for Russia, and also a country that has already had its borders violated, right, with Russia annexing Crimea earlier in the spring. That is the challenge here. It's a challenge for Ukraine, a challenge for Europe, and certainly a challenge for the president.
So that was the report from Ukraine from CNN's Jim Sciutto on CNN State of the Union this morning, basically saying that it's kind of a lopsided election and that there's good turnout in the western side, Kiev and those areas, but I think I saw one report that said like 20% turnout in the eastern part, and I'm going to show, here's a clip of Alex Marquardt on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, hosted by Martha Raddatz this morning. Martha Raddatz put it to him to report on what was going on in Ukraine, and here's how they cover it on that network this morning here.
Good morning, Martha. This is a momentous vote for Ukraine, one full of hope for these long lines of voters who want to elect someone who can end the chaos and reunite this country. There has been a strong turnout here in the capital, Kiev, but in the violent eastern part of the country where the Ukrainian military is trying to put down a pro-Russian insurgency, the vast majority of polling stations have been shut down, election officials scared and threatened by pro-Russian separatists. This is the first round of this election, which is expected to be won by pro-Western billionaire Petro Poroshenko, also known as the Chocolate King for the candy empire that he runs. And of course, looming large over this vote is Russian President Vladimir Putin, who says that a civil war is already raging in Ukraine, but is showing signs of possibly softening his stance, easing tensions by saying he will work with Ukraine's next president. Martha?
So yeah, that's the ABC News coverage of what's going on in Ukraine, and how it basically the same thing, lopsided election with good turnout on the west and some problems in the east. And they talked about the front runner, this chocolate king, was named Poroshenko. And before I talk about that a little more, I want to show the extended coverage over on Fox News Sunday. Their reporter Greg Palkott, I think he was in eastern Ukraine. That was kind of, some of them were in western Ukraine talking about the problems in the east, and some were actually in eastern Ukraine. Here's Greg Palkott. I can't remember which side he was on, and he basically gives the same story about the lopsided election that I'll talk a little more about after I show that clip over here.
Chris, it is a tense day in this region. Pro-Russia separatists are doing everything they can to derail the presidential elections here. They are seizing and smashing ballot boxes. They're blocking voters from going to the polls. They're attacking polling stations and basically showing off their well-armed muscle all around town. For example, here in Donetsk, a city of 1 million, there is basically nobody voting. The same with another major city, Luhansk. Across this region, officials say only around 20% of the election districts are functioning. We stopped in on one. Take a look at what we saw. Something very rare in eastern Ukraine, voting in the presidential elections here in the town of Dobropilya. The turnout, we are told, is pretty normal. However, the people here, we are also told, are a bit nervous. Now, even in that town, we saw a heavily armed pro-Kiev militia just right around the corner from the voting, waiting to do battle with rebel militants if they arrive. Still, across the rest of the country, voting is going as planned. The turnout is said to be high. The election is seen as locking in gains from pro-democracy uprisings here earlier this year, and maybe getting a government in place that can deal with the situation here and deal with Russia. Vladimir Putin has claimed he will respect the outcome of the vote. Chris.
So yeah, that was the Fox News Sunday report on what's going on in Ukraine, which is fairly similar to what I showed both from ABC's This Week and from CNN's State of the Union. I don't think there was any coverage on CBS's Face the Nation. I hope I'm not reporting that wrong, but I believe that was the station that had no coverage of what happened in Ukraine, or not that I recall. And Fox News Sunday actually had one thing that the other stations didn't have. They had a lawmaker, U.S. lawmaker, actually in Ukraine reporting on what she saw. This is Republican Senator Kelly Ayotte, who's basically saying the same thing you saw in all those reports about problems on the east side of Ukraine within the election. And she goes a little bit further and she blames it specifically on Vladimir Putin, as you can see over in this clip.
Well, what we've seen, Chris, is high turnout throughout Ukraine. Obviously, Donetsk, Luhansk, the security situation there is preventing many people from voting in those two regions. And I just want to make clear, there's one person to blame for that security situation, and that's Vladimir Putin, because he has strategic control of what is happening there. It's paid mercenaries. It's also the violence and the intimidation and the fear for the people that live in that region.
As you mentioned, there was a lot of talk and considerable violence from pro-Russian separatists who said they were not going to allow this election to take place. I know you're in Kiev, in the western part of the country, but what reports are you getting from the eastern part in how effective the separatists have been in disrupting the election in that part of the country?
Well, I think unfortunately in Donetsk and Luhansk, we don't have observers there because of the security situation. They have disrupted the elections there, but in the rest of Ukraine, particularly here in Kiev, the polling stations that I visited, high turnout, people are waiting patiently. They want to exercise their right to vote and to elect a new president. And I think what you see here is actually pushback against what has happened with the Russian aggression. So that's what we're seeing in this part of the country. But make no mistake, obviously, in the eastern part of Ukraine and Donetsk and Luhansk, those elections are being disrupted for many Ukrainians, and Putin is the one that can dial this up or dial this down.
So that's Republican Senator Kelly Ayotte blaming Vladimir Putin for anti-election violence in the eastern side of Ukraine, and that is the fact that there is that election violence was in all the reports I showed you. And The one last clip I want to show you on the election in Ukraine today is Kelly Ayotte talking about a discussion she had with the front runner in the election, this Chocolate King guy. His name is, let me make sure I get it right, Petro Poroshenko. And I saw him discussed on multiple programs. I'm not showing all the clips, but apparently he has ties with the West and ties with the East, so maybe he will conciliate some sort of solution here, which I will discuss a little more after I show that final Ukraine election clip. Kelly Ayotte on Fox News Sunday this morning here.
Favorite to win this election, as we mentioned with the panel in the last segment, is the candy tycoon Petro Poroshenko, who's known as the Chocolate King. Now, if he gets more than 50% of the vote, he avoids a runoff. Otherwise, he and the other top finisher have a runoff in mid-June. Not to prejudge the election, but if Poroshenko were to win and he is seen as someone who can do business with both the East and the West, where would that leave Ukraine, do you believe?
Well, I actually met with Poroshenko yesterday, along with our delegation, where I think it leaves Ukraine. He was very clear, actually, that he would not accept the annexation of Crimea. He would actually like us to increase our support in terms of their military. He would also, I think that as you look, he will try to reach out to eastern Ukraine to establish more communication and ties there for the people who are there. But he also wants us to continue, and I think there's a general feeling here of pushing back on Putin so they can have security in that area, because obviously the violence that's being fomented interferes with unifying the country.
Senator.
So I thought that was kind of interesting bit of the interview there, not a direct interview with the front runner in the election in Ukraine, but a hearsay description of what he said from United States Senator Kelly Ayotte. And one of the interesting things I think about the Ukraine election story, I've covered the Ukraine-Russia conflict in a whole bunch of LiberalViewer Sunday live clip roundups. It was the lead story a lot of the time, and I think it's interesting that now the big election happens today and it's barely covered on some of the networks, and it wasn't the lead story because of these other stories. I think that is a little bit strange, although I guess understandable given these other stories. And speaking of stories that would have got a lot more coverage if there hadn't been the shooting and the VA scandal, and of course the Ukraine election. One story that was only covered over on ABC's This Week was the indictment of these Chinese military officials who are supposedly responsible for commercial espionage, cyber spying, and I'll talk about that a little more after I show. This is the report from ABC's Pierre Thomas on This Week with George Stephanopoulos this morning, hosted by Martha Raddatz over in this clip.
Details.
The FBI claims the scale of China's theft of U.S. company research, design, and marketing strategy had reached a point where something had to be done.
The amount of theft that's going on is simply staggering.
So for the first time ever, Justice Department prosecutors charged the Chinese military with hacking into U.S. companies, stealing extraordinary amounts of trade secrets, of state-sponsored economic espionage, costing American jobs.
It's going to make a big difference in the competitive landscape. American companies won't exist anymore in some fields.
Richard Bakelet was part of the security firm Mandiant that helped uncover the alleged Chinese hacking.
Last year alone, 3,000 U.S. companies received notification that they had had a significant breach. Most of those could be attributed to the Chinese.
So in other words, we spend billions and billions of dollars developing products to sell, and then they take those secrets and therefore they don't have to spend the money?
That's exactly right. We're at a really vulnerable point here.
Case in point. 5 Chinese military officials, allegedly part of a specialized Army unit known as 61398, were charged this week with targeting U.S. companies. The Chinese government called the charges bogus, fabricated.
Do you have the goods?
We would prove beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury of 12 who would agree unanimously that this conduct was done by these 5 guys.
It's a delicate line for the U.S. after Edward Snowden revealed the U.S. engaged in its own spying against our own allies.
Some critics of what the U.S. government did on Monday in charging these military officials would say, look at what the NSA is doing. We're spying all the time. Isn't this hypocrisy?
We are not targeting private companies in order to take their trade secrets and then pass them to American companies.
We are aware of no nation in the world that publicly states that theft of information for commercial gain is acceptable.
The stakes could not be higher, and with these charges, the U.S. entered a new frontier in the geopolitical fight with China for economic supremacy. For This Week, Pierre.
So yeah, that was the report from Pierre Thomas on ABC's This Week that I thought that delineated this conflict or hypocrisy, or I don't want to, hypocrisy is more of a pejorative term, but I guess that's my opinion, about how the Obama administration is trying to crack down on this commercial spying when they're doing all this national security spying. And they touched on that in the report. And I think I saw later in the discussion in a clip I'm not showing, they talked about how that doesn't really make sense because most countries don't make that delineation. They think all spying is spying, and you can't really complain about commercial espionage. Like the French apparently do a lot of commercial espionage as well, and they don't make that distinction between commercial espionage and the national security spying. And before I leave the topic, I want to show a former ambassador to China and also former presidential candidate, John Huntsman, who was like the most moderate of all the candidates in 2012 in the primaries, trying to be the Republican nominee. He's from a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints, a governor of Utah formerly, and he didn't make it very far in the presidential election, but because he's or the presidential primaries, but because he's a former ambassador to China, he has some insight into the Chinese commercial espionage, and he was also on this commission that looked at intellectual property theft that Martha Raddatz asked him about, quoted the findings of his commission and asked him about the espionage, and he actually gave some good numbers on the full extent of the problem that I'll talk about a little more after I show that clip over here.
Governor Huntsman, I want to start with you. You were also the co-chair of the Commission on the Theft of American Intellectual Property. One of the things the commission found was, quote, the American response to date of hectoring governments and prosecuting individuals has been utterly inadequate to deal with the problem. So what good does this indictment do? Is the Obama administration doing enough?
Well, it's been a problem for probably 40 years, which is to say the whole length of the U.S.-China relationship formally. And it ratcheted up about, I'd say, 8 years ago with the creation of this PLA unit, 61398, and the systematic development of indigenous innovation, which is to say picking winners locally in the Chinese economy. So we have a real problem today, and we assessed theft of intellectual property as costing the United States roughly $300 billion per year. So that's all, everybody combined. I'd say China's probably 70% of that number. But what it does, Martha, it gets to the heart and soul of innovation and trade secrets and the creation of new industries in America that we do better than anybody else. And it's really hard to put a price tag on innovation in a creative environment.
Let me ask you again.
So I thought that was an interesting topic, and the fact that these military officers from these Chinese military officers were indicted this week probably would have been a bigger story if it hadn't been for all these other big stories. And you know, I guess they have limited time on their broadcast, so they can't cover them all. But I wanted to show at least those couple clips on this this Chinese cyber spying story, and let me know what you think about that, and whether you think there's really a distinction between commercial espionage and the NSA spying story that I've covered so many times on LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup in the past. And also, speaking of stories that probably would have gotten more coverage if it hadn't been for these other stories, President Obama showed up for this Memorial Day visit to the troops in Afghanistan this morning, and that only got covered on CNN State of the Union, the second broadcast, because it was just breaking news late this morning. But there were a few good clips on that on CNN State of the Union that I want to show. First, this is their reporter, Barbara Starr, their Pentagon reporter, talking about how the visit is both has some benefit to the troops, but also has sort of political aspects, and also how it's a visit to the troops, but not to Afghanistan, and not getting involved in the politics of Afghanistan. And I'll talk about that a little more after I show that clip over here.
President Obama, I don't think it's a big surprise that he wanted to go to Afghanistan again and visit the troops. It's been a while since he's been there. The war in Afghanistan, many people feel Americans have somewhat forgotten. There are 30,000 troops in that war zone still risking their lives every day. Thankfully, the casualties are down, the number of wounded are down, but still great risk for American forces, all of them serving in that war zone. So I think we can expect to see the president in the coming hours visit with the troops, go to the hospital at Bagram, see them. But we are getting some indication that he's going to try and stay out of Afghanistan politics. There is a runoff election for president scheduled for next month. Very sensitive business. Who will succeed President Hamid Karzai, who's been a tough customer for the U.S. to deal with, a very contentious situation. They are going to look forward to getting a new president in there perhaps in the coming weeks, Candy.
So yeah, I thought that was an interesting analysis of the president's trip in terms of his visit to the troops, but trying to pretend that he's not really visiting Afghanistan because he doesn't want to involve himself in the politics. And then there was actually this extended analysis of the situation also on CNN State of the Union from their reporter Jim Acosta, who I guess it's their White House reporter, but I guess he's along on the trip in Afghanistan with the president, and I'll talk about that a little more after I show that clip here.
Right, Candy, and I think Barbara laid that out very well. Afghanistan has been very much a forgotten war in the minds of many Americans, and so this trip by the president, his fourth during his presidency and his first since May of 2012, will definitely highlight the price that is being paid in Afghanistan. And as Barbara was saying, this is a very big year for the president when it comes to Afghanistan. This White House is determined whether they have a bilateral security agreement with the Afghanistan government or not to pull U.S. forces out of that country by the end of the year. They'll leave a residual force if they can, hammer out some sort of security agreement for the years to come. But that will be a light footprint type of force. And so this is the beginning of the end of U.S. engagement in Afghanistan. And I think this trip by the president marks that to some extent. There are a couple of other things going on, Candy. There's the VA scandal that has been going on right now, and the president has been stung by that. And so we understand that in addition to giving a speech there in Afghanistan, he'll be visiting a hospital when he's on the ground there. And so the president will be seeing, exactly the sacrifice that is being paid firsthand. And Candy, you're right. This is a very big week for the president when it comes to foreign policy. On Wednesday, he'll be at West Point delivering the commencement address, and during that commencement address, he is expected to lay out, according to White House officials, his foreign policy vision for the last 2.5 years of his presidency. He's come under heavy criticism, as you know, Candy, over the last several weeks. During that trip to Asia, he was peppered with questions at almost every stop. What does the Obama doctrine say about Syria? Do you allow this bloody war, this bloody civil war, to continue without any U.S. involvement, or does the U.S. get involved? And so the president is expected to lay out some themes as to when the U.S. gets involved. When it doesn't get involved, we'll hear some more about that on Wednesday. But no question about it, this is a huge trip for the president and a huge trip for the soldiers who are serving in Afghanistan. A lot of them, I'm sure, have this feeling that Americans just aren't paying that close attention to what's happening over there.
So yeah, I thought that was a pretty interesting analysis of what's going on in Afghanistan and the upcoming end of U.S. troops at the end of the year, which I've covered in previous broadcasts. It depends on the outcome of the election and whether there'll be residual forces like the reporter there was talking about. And I also thought it was interesting how he was talking about Obama's foreign policy and the Obama doctrine, which there are some clips that I decided not to show where they were talking about whether there even is an Obama doctrine. And it, as someone who was a history student, I'm kind of interested in that as to I used to study history of U.S. foreign policy, and most presidents get their doctrine along the way, and it's kind of hard to say what the Obama doctrine is, and that may be decided, and we may hear more about that in this speech that he's giving at West Point on Wednesday, so maybe I'll get a chance to cover that on the show next week. And I will show one more clip on this issue. Candy Crowley talked about who President Obama brought with him, and I guess she was trying to make a joke that I'll talk about a little more after I show that last clip on the surprise Obama visit to Afghanistan that you can see here.
With us, we certainly will do that and expect it to be so. So, a surprise Memorial Day visit by the President of the United States and country western star Brad Paisley. And you might want to take a vote afterwards to see which one the troops are more excited to see. But this certainly is a big bolster to these troops because this has been, in a large sense, a war that, despite the fact it is ongoing and the 30,000 American troops are there, it has been out of the headlines recently. So
yeah, there's Candy Crowley asking who is more popular with the troops? Is it President Obama or is it country singer Brad Paisley? I don't know that. I don't know about that joke. But speaking of jokes, before I finish up the broadcast, I want to show two more quick clips of HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher. Bill Maher actually had on this journalist and documentarian who is an undocumented immigrant here in the United States, and talked about some immigration issues, how President Obama has actually caused a lot of harm to immigrants, and then also this issue about immigrant drivers. Anyway, the name of this journalist and documentarian, he's Jose Antonio Vargas, and I'll talk about that a little more after I show that clip over here.
What we have, so I haven't seen my mother for 21 years, right? This is part of the film. There are countless American citizens in this country who are separated from their families, right? We call mixed status families, right? 17 million mixed status families in which 1% of the family is undocumented. Families are separated every day, right? 1,000 deportations happening every day. And yet there's no fierce urgency of now. Where is that when it comes to this issue? All we have is a political hot potato that nobody wants to touch. Right. And yet here we are, driving on the same freeways as you are, going to the same church as you are, paying the exact
driving
same
better.
Taxes. Thank you. Yes.
Believe me, that is one thing people in LA know. That the Hispanic folks drive perfectly because they don't want to fuck with the law enforcement people. Whereas the white people drive horribly.
Thank you for saying that, because if I said
You're
that,
welcome.
it would
right. No, but
it is so true. It's a very important.
You know, I just wanted to show that clip because I was recently on a panel having to do with immigration issues where I talked about the Trust Act, and I don't want to go into that whole thing, but one of the other people on the panel was this undocumented immigrant who was talking about the new law in California that gives undocumented immigrants driver's licenses so that they don't have to worry about getting sent to jail for driving without a license and deported just because they get pulled over. And it was kind of listening to how this person described her fear of just driving all the time whenever she was driving. It was kind of it was another one of those heartrending stories, I guess. And so when I saw that clip on HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher last Friday, I wanted to show you that clip because it's an important issue to me anyway. And one final clip I want to show before I take a quick look at the comment section, though I'm way over time already, almost to an hour and 15 minutes it looks like. And but I want to show this one clip about where Bill Maher's talking about his Flip a District program, because there's something he said that it sounded like it was supposed to be a joke, but the lawyer in me made me think that this was actually some kind of legal disclaimer to avoid a campaign finance violation, as I will explain in a little more detail after I show that final clip of the show for tonight from HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher and his Flip a District program that you can see here.
And we couldn't resist putting on the board from North Carolina's 2nd District Republican Renee Elmers because her opponent is Clay Aiken. Wait a second. Not that I'm for Clay Aiken or any candidate. I would like to make this very clear. The Flip a District campaign does not favor or endorse any candidate. Our purpose and our attitude is completely negative. So remember...
So I thought that was kind of interesting because, that sounded like a joke, how he's not for anyone, he's just against everyone, like a cynical attitude. But actually, to me, that sounded more like he was saying that he's not endorsing anyone so that it's not a corporate contribution to Clay Aiken, which if he were giving airtime and, HBO were giving airtime in support of Clay Aiken, that might be seen as some sort of contribution to the campaign. And of course, Bill Maher's famous for giving $1 million to a super PAC in favor of the Obama campaign, so it's not like he couldn't be charged with making this contribution. So I'm not sure. You let me know what you think, but it looks to me like what he was saying there was disguised as a joke, but was really something that lawyers wanted him to say to avoid making a campaign contribution to Clay Aiken in his Flip a District program. Anyway, those are all the clips I want to show you. I'm way over time here, so I want to finish up the show for tonight. But I noticed I did have 70 or 80 people fluctuating towards the end here, and I want to honor that and flip through the comment section here real quick and see if I can see a couple things. I noticed when, even when I don't get a chance to get to the comments at the end, while I'm playing clips, I'm always looking through the comments to see what people are saying. So in that way, you always make my show more informed. I saw someone saying that they had Asperger's syndrome, and I'd be interested to see what someone who has Asperger's syndrome thinks about what I said, that it's not even going to be a real diagnosis, although of course those people will still be have a condition on autism spectrum disorder. Where was that person? I can't, there's a lot of arguing with each other here, and I'm going to try to pick out one more comment that's not arguing with each other before I finish up. Let's see, Music Miscreant says, after Afghanistan, Pakistan will be the next foreign policy area of military concentration. Well, that's a big problem with the end of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, is it's kind of a staging area for our drone attacks on the Pakistani Taliban in the tribal regions between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And Pakistan is a lot more strategic than Afghanistan because, of course, they have nuclear weapons, which is a huge concern of the United States. So that is definitely one reason why the United States might want to have this agreement to keep forces in Afghanistan after the end of the year, even though they won't have a major combat role, and that would be to have some base to send drones into Pakistan. Of course, that's really controversial, and some people think it's using war powers outside of a war zone. And anyway, I guess I'm really over time here, so I want to finish up the show, but I appreciate that I have 70 or 80 viewers, and I should be making a video for you upcoming this week, probably upload it for you on Tuesday night, I think, where I'll be taking clips out of a district attorney debate that I helped organize for my local district attorney candidates. And I actually got to help write a couple of the questions. If you look in my liked videos, you can see the whole debate, and maybe you can pick out which were the questions that I wrote. And I'm going to make a video about that called LiberalViewer Asks Loaded Questions to Prosecutors or something like that. And so look for that. And anyway, I appreciate you all joining me for LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. I hope you enjoyed the clips I picked out for you, and I'll be seeing you every Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Pacific, trying to pick out clips to make your end of your weekend or beginning of your week a little bit more informed about what the corporate media thinks is important here in the United States. And I'll be seeing you all around the internet.